subject I need to talk to you about this morning. It's about our schedule, okay? Because before class, when I was getting ready to figure out what I was going to talk about today, I took a look at our schedule. And I noticed that our next exam is not scheduled until November 5th. Okay? And I compared that to last year's schedule. We have the same number of weeks as last year, I believe. And I realized that I should have really probably scheduled it for November 3rd.
What?
No, don't worry, I'm not going to move it. Okay, don't worry. But the problem is that all I had scheduled for exam 3 was chapter 12 on nervous tissue. Okay, that's what I had originally planned. But the problem is this is only October 24th, and November 5th is a week and a half away from now. So what are we going to do then for the next week and a half?
Study.
Now, I can't just cancel class because I would be negligent as a professor if I did that. Okay?
So review.
So, the way I see it, okay, and I'm gonna take some executive privilege here, but the way I see it, we have two options then. Okay? Option one is that we move up the exam to this coming Monday.
Oh my God. No.
I don't think that would be a good idea either. Okay. I don't think, being that I had it scheduled for a week and a half from now, almost 2 weeks from now, I don't think that, plus this is homecoming weekend, right? So that would be a bad idea. Would you agree? Okay. So, option B would be to add another chapter, chapter 13, which is a relatively short chapter.
Relatively.
Chapter 13 is just on the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a lot less complex than the brain. All right?
What?
So to do that, I'm going to have to make some adjustments, though. I'm going to have to add, so we'll have 2 chapters on the next exam, which shouldn't be too bad. And that'll give us plenty of time to get through another
Will
short
it be 50
chapter.
questions then? Will it be 50 questions?
It's up to you. What do you think?
What?
Want to do 50 questions then on the exam? I think I can do that. Yeah, that's not a problem. That's not a problem.
Professor, what was like option C?
What?
What was like option C or D? Is there option C?
Option C, I Okay, so I have updated the syllabus that's on Canvas. Okay, now I may have to make some more adjustments later on. And I do have study questions for chapter 13. They are on Canvas, but they are listed for exam 4. They're listed under exam 4 study questions. I will move those over to this list of study questions to exam 3. I'll do that after class today. Okay? Because I decided. I don't know how we got so far ahead. I really don't. I have no idea. I have no idea. Huh? So.
Are we not going to have a review then at all?
We should still be able to have time for a review. Yeah. It should. In fact, we may have time for more than one review because chapter 13 is fairly short. So, the structure of the spinal cord, I can go through in one day easily, less than a day, and then we'll spend some time on the spinal nerves on Wednesday, and then Friday you should be able to go over the spinal reflexes and then we should have a whole day to do review. Okay? So we're going to start chapter 13 today then. So I want to start out with a review question from chapter 12, which has to do with neural integration. The question is, what do you call a synapse between a synaptic knob and the axon of a postsynaptic neuron? Shouldn't be too hard figuring that out just by looking at the makeup of the words. The code is spinal. I should have used the code spinal tap because that's both a medical term as well as the name of a band. Anybody ever heard of Spinal Tap? I think they made a movie about it, about that band. May have been a fictitious band to begin with. Okay, well, let's take a look at everybody's responses. Most of you said axonic synapse, and that's correct. Okay. All right. Okay, so today we're going to start chapter 13, which is on the spinal cord, some of the spinal nerves, and the spinal reflexes. So, the spinal cord is made up of a cylinder of nervous tissue that extends from the brainstem down to the first lumbar vertebrae, or L1. And it actually only occupies the upper two-thirds of the vertebral canal. Vertebral canal is that large hole in the vertebrae the spinal cord goes down through. And the rest of the vertebral canal, below L1, there are vertebral foramina in those vertebrae, but that's occupied by a bundle of nerve fibers that's called the cauda equina. And the cauda equina, equine means horses, and cauda means tail. So cauda equina means horse's tail, because that's what it looked like to the first anatomist who described it. Oh, I turned my clicker on there. There we go. Okay, so the function of the spinal cord includes conduction of signals up and down the trunk so that the brain can communicate with the rest of the body. Also, the spinal cord functions as an integration center for spinal reflexes, which we'll talk about later on in this chapter. Spinal reflexes are protective responses that occur automatically without conscious thought. And the integration center is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then finally, there's also a third major function of the spinal cord that I think not many people are aware of, but there's actually groups of neurons in the spinal cord called central pattern generators. And those actually help to coordinate repetitive contraction of muscle groups in the limbs during walking. So this coordination center in the spinal cord is sort of like the cerebellum of the brain, which also helps to coordinate motor activity. Now, we haven't talked about the brain yet, but the spinal cord is surrounded by three layers of connective tissue, just like the brain is surrounded by 3 layers of connective tissue. These connective tissue layers are collectively called the meninges. And the meninges have several functions. The main one is they help protect the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? So the outermost layer of the meninges is the one you see down here, this brownish colored layer. This is a very, very tough connective tissue layer called the dura mater. And the dura mater has lots of collagen fibers which make it very, very tough. So that's a very tough outermost covering. Then there's a middle layer. The middle layer is actually much thinner and more delicate because part of this middle layer is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This middle layer is called the pia mater. It's a very thin, sort of semi-translucent layer. And there, in the deeper parts of the pia mater, they're just little thin filaments that, I'm sorry, not pia mater, I'm sorry, arachnoid mater. Arachnoid mater. Okay. The deepest layer is the so the arachnoid mater, the deeper layer, has little thin filaments with lots of spaces in between them. Little filaments reminded anatomists of spider legs. So arachnoid actually means spider. So there's sort of 2 parts to the arachnoid mater. That's this clear layer right here. The outer layer is just a thin, translucent sheet that's in contact with the dura mater. The deeper area has little filaments that go down and connect to the pia mater, which is the deepest layer. In between these little spider leg-looking structures, there's cerebral spinal fluid, which helps to carry away waste products produced by the spinal cord, and it also helps to protect. It also helps to protect the spinal cord. Then, the deepest layer is another very, very thin layer called the pia mater, and the pia mater is attached very tightly to the surface of the spinal cord, just like it's attached right to the very surface of the brain. And so there are 3 different layers. Collectively, those are called the meninges. Okay, now, up here at the top, this is the spinal cord right here, traveling through the vertebral foramen. So this whole area right here is the vertebral foramen. So here's the body of one of the cervical vertebrae. You can tell because of the transverse foramina. And up here, this is the lamina. Here's the spinous process. There's the transverse process over here. So the spinal cord does run through the vertebral foramina of the vertebrae down to L1. And below that is just a bundle of fibers. But there's actually a layer of fat surrounding the meninges inside that vertebral foramen. And that space that contains that fat is called the epidural space. And that epidural space is where they inject anesthesia when they do a spinal block. So when they do a spinal block where they inject anesthesia, next to your spinal cord, they don't inject that right in your spinal cord. If they did that, they'd damage the nerves or the neurons in the spinal cord. And instead, they inject it into that epidural space, hence the name epidural block. That's another name for spinal block. And then the anesthesia can then diffuse through the meninges and into the spinal cord. So this shows this just shows how they do an epidural block. They inject it into that space, and then from there it just diffuses through the. There's a layer of cerebral spinal fluid, and then right here in the middle, this is the spinal cord here. So you can see they don't inject it right in the spinal cord because that could damage the spinal cord. So it is a very delicate procedure, though. That's why a lot of times they use special imaging techniques like ultrasound to help guide the needle in so they don't stick it in too far and damage the spinal cord. There's always that risk, though, of something like that going wrong. So personally, for me, I would rather just have them give me general anesthesia rather than running the risk of damaging the spinal cord. Okay, now, if you take a look at a cross-section through the middle of the spinal cord, you can see that there's two different kinds of neural tissue in the spinal cord. The outer part of the spinal cord is made up of a kind of nervous tissue called white matter. White matter is made up mostly of myelinated axons and neuroglial cells. And so the myelinated axons in the white matter carry signals up and down the spinal cord. So some parts of this white matter consist of ascending tracts of axons that carry signals up to the brain. Other areas contain descending motor tracts that carry signals from the brain down through the spinal cord and eventually out spinal nerves to effectors like the skeletal muscles. Then the deeper parts of the spinal cord are made up of a darker colored tissue called gray matter. That's another type of nervous tissue. The gray matter is made up mostly of cell bodies of neurons, or the soma of neurons, and also neuroglial cells. And because there's not large amounts of myelinated axons in the gray matter, it has a darker appearance than the white matter. So if you compare the kinds of tissues of the spinal cord to the brain, which we'll be studying later after a third exam, you'll notice that on the brain there's a thin layer of gray matter on the outside, and it's highly folded into convolutions. It's kind of the opposite of the spinal cord. The spinal cord, the gray matter is mostly located in the deeper parts of the spinal cord, and the outer layer of the spinal cord is made up of white matter. Okay, now there is some gray matter in the deeper parts of the cerebrum, but most of your gray matter is on the outside of the brain. Now, in cross-section, there are a number of important landmarks that are part of the structure of the spinal cord. One of the more important ones is a hollow canal right in the very center of the spinal cord. That hollow canal is called the central canal. And that central canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is a watery fluid that circulates throughout both the brain and the spinal cord, and it helps to carry away waste products. Then, on the anterior side, down here, this is the front of the spinal cord, so this is towards the front of your body. There's a slit, a deep slit, that's called the anterior median fissure. Okay. And then, on the posterior side, there's a more narrow slit called the posterior median sulcus. So those two slits, the anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus, that sort of partially divides the spinal cord into a right and left half. It doesn't completely subdivide it, but it divides most of the white matter. Okay. Then, if you look at the gray matter in the deeper parts of the spinal cord, the gray matter has three lateral lobes to it. These lobes are referred to as horns. Okay? And so on the anterior side, right here and right here, that's called the anterior horn of the spinal cord. The anterior horns are where the cell bodies of the motor neurons are located. So motor neurons are located right in here. And then the motor neurons are multipolar neurons, so they have one long axon. The axons of these motor neurons that are in the anterior horn travel out of the spinal cord through this route right here, this bundle of nerve fibers. This bundle of nerve fibers is referred to as the anterior root of the spinal cord. And so signals travel from the anterior horn through the anterior root, and then from there those signals go out through the spinal nerves to your muscles so that they can activate muscles. Then there's in some parts of the spinal cord, mainly in the middle parts of the spinal cord, there's a very small lateral horn. In the lateral horn there are neurons that are association or interneurons that are involved in processing of information. And then on the dorsal side or posterior side, there's also a posterior horn. The posterior horn is where the signals from the sensory neurons travel into. So the sensory neurons carry signals through this posterior root. This bundle of nerves right here on both sides of the spinal cord is called the posterior root. The sensory nerves travel through the posterior root, and then they enter the gray matter in the posterior horns of the spinal cord. So let me kind of just draw some arrows here to show you the direction that the signals travel to get in and out of the spinal cord. So let's see. I'll draw this in red. So sensory signals are carried from sensory receptors throughout the body through the spinal nerves, and then from the spinal nerves it travels into the posterior root. Whoops, I slipped there. Signals travel up through the posterior root. I don't know why it's doing that. And then from there it goes into the posterior horn. Those sensory signals that travel through that sensory route then synapse with interneurons that are located right between the posterior horn and the anterior horn. And then if those sensory signals are significant enough, then those interneurons may stimulate a motor neuron, which then carries the signals out through the anterior horn, or excuse me, anterior root of the spinal cord. So signals go in the posterior part of the spinal cord, and then they come out through the anterior part. So there's separate routes for sensory and motor signals going in and out of the spinal cord. And there's a disease that sometimes can affect the posterior roots of the spinal cord. The posterior root again is right up here, right here. There's a venereal disease actually that if it's left untreated can destroy those posterior roots of the spinal cord. And that venereal disease is syphilis. Syphilis is caused by a spiral-shaped bacterium. It's sexually transmitted. And syphilis can go through several different stages. If it's left untreated, it goes into the third stage, which is called the tertiary stage of syphilis. It starts destroying parts of the nervous system. And one part that it destroys are these posterior roots, which is the route that sensory signals travel into the spinal cord. And so if someone is experiencing tertiary syphilis, one of the symptoms is they have trouble walking. They can't walk in a very coordinated fashion, so they'll just kind of stumble around. The reason for that is they're not receiving sensory feedback from the joints and muscles in their legs. And without that feedback, the brain can't coordinate the motor activity of walking, so they have trouble walking. Okay. So syphilis is a disease you don't want to leave to go untreated. The first stage is actually rather temporary. You get a large sore on your genitals that disappears, and then it goes into a secondary stage, and then if it doesn't get treated, eventually it can start destroying those posterior roots of the spinal cord. Okay, now, also, there's a large egg-shaped structure right here, located right on the first part of the posterior root of the spinal cord. That's called the dorsal root ganglion, or the spinal ganglion. And that's where the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located. They're all clustered together in that ganglion. And the cell bodies of the sensory neurons in that ganglion are surrounded by satellite cells, which is one of the two types of neuroglia that's found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so those are some of the important parts of the spinal cord that you can see in cross-section. This is a diagram from your textbook, and I'm not going to expect that you know this information, but I just wanted to show you that the ascending and descending tracts, which are groups of nerve fibers, travel through the spinal cord in different places. Most of the descending motor tracts carry signals. Whoops, sorry. Most of the descending tracts, which are shown in the green here, they're concentrated in the anterior part of the white matter and the lateral parts of the white matter. Most of the ascending tracts that are carrying sensory signals up to the brain are located in the posterior white matter, and then there's some other areas of the, some superficial areas of the lateral white matter, and then some deep areas. The areas kind of right in the middle are mostly descending tracts. And anatomists, of course, have given different names for these different ascending and descending tracts. For example, these ascending sensory tracts that are located in the posterior part of the white matter, that whole area is called the posterior funiculus. This area down here, these areas down here, these are referred to as the vestibulospinal tracts. Okay, I'm not going to expect that you know that. Okay, just all I'm showing this for is to show you that the ascending and descending pathways in the spinal cord are separate. They don't. They're not all mixed together. Okay, now along the spinal cord, in between two adjacent vertebrae, there's a pair of spinal nerves that exits the spinal cord, and they're located on both sides. The names of these spinal nerves are named for the vertebrae that's just adjacent to it. So there's a total of 8 cervical spinal nerves, because there's one just above C1, and then there's one just above C7, so that's a total of 8 cervical spinal nerves. there's a total of 12 thoracic nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, and then there's 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and then there are 5 sacral spinal nerves. Those sacral spinal nerves go out through those sacral foramina in the sacrum. And then there's actually 1 coccygeal nerve. There's one nerve that comes out between 2 of the parts of the coccyx. So altogether, there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And most of them are what are called mixed nerves. A mixed nerve is a nerve that contains both motor as well as sensory fibers. These spinal nerves along the middle of the trunk extend out, and then they have smaller branches which supply the skin and the muscles along the trunk. But in some places along the spinal cord, the spinal nerves come out and they form complex net-like arrangements of nerves. And these complex kind of net-like arrangement of nerves are referred to as plexuses. And there are 4 major plexuses. And they're located mainly where your arms and legs are attached to your trunk. But there's also one in the cervical region up here in the neck. This cervical plexus gives rise to nerves that supply some of the muscles in the neck. And the cervical plexus also gives rise to a pair of very, very important nerves called the phrenic nerves. The phrenic nerves come off the cervical plexus and they extend down through the upper part of the trunk to the diaphragm. The phrenic nerves supply the diaphragm with motor fibers. And so the phrenic nerve is what stimulates your diaphragm to contract. So that's a very, very important nerve. If those phrenic nerves were to become damaged or cut, then you wouldn't be able to breathe. So that's a pretty important pair of nerves, right? Then, right below the cervical plexus, there's another one that's located right at the base of your shoulder called the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus gives rise to nerves that supply the skin and muscles in your arms. And there are 3 major nerves that are branches of the brachial plexus that extend all the way down to your hand and supply the skin and muscles in your arm and your hand. There's a radial nerve on the radial side of your forearm, goes down, supplies some of the skin on the posterior 1/3 of the hand. There's also a median nerve that supplies the, the radial nerve supplies the lateral half of the dorsum of your hand, and the lateral 1/3 of the palm of your hand. There's a median nerve that supplies the medial 2/3 of the palm of your hand. And then there's an ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve supplies mainly the medial half of the dorsum of your hand. I've got a map that shows the cutaneous distribution of these. But all those little parts of the plexus where these nerves become interconnected and then divide again and then connect together again. All those different parts do have names. There's roots, there's cords, there's divisions, and then finally it gives rise to the name nerves that supply the skin and muscles that supply the arm. Let me see if I've got that. Whoops. Go the wrong way. I've got a new presenter, so we'll come back to this later. Then finally, there's 2 other plexuses down here in the pelvic region. The first one is the lumbar plexus. Lumbar plexus is made up of spinal nerves L1 through L4. And the lumbar plexus gives rise to a nerve called the obturator nerve, which supplies your adductor muscles, which are located, your adductors are what people commonly call your groin muscles. It supplies these muscles in the upper medial part of your thigh. And then below the lumbar plexus is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus gives rise to the largest nerve in the body, which is the sciatic nerve. And the sciatic nerve branches just above the knee to form a tibial nerve and fibular nerve, which supplies your lower leg and your foot. But the main branch of the sacral plexus is the sciatic nerve, which passes through that greater sciatic notch, I would call this. All right. Now, along the trunk, not where these plexuses are located, but along the trunk, there are three major branches of each spinal nerve. The largest of the three branches, right here, is called the anterior ramus of the spinal cord, or of the spinal nerve. The word ramus means branch. So there's three branches of these spinal nerves along your trunk. The anterior ramus extends along the lateral sides of your trunk, all the way to the front of your thorax and your abdomen. Okay, so the anterior ramus supplies the anterior part, the lateral and anterior parts of your trunk. The second largest branch, and these are somatic branches, by the way, so they supply voluntary muscles, is the posterior ramus. Posterior ramus, as you see here, supplies muscles on the posterior side of your trunk, as well as the skin on the posterior side of your trunk. And then there's one other really tiny little branch, somatic branch of the spinal nerves. It's this one right here. It's a really teeny tiny one. It's called the meningeal branch. And the meningeal branch supplies the meninges that surround the spinal cord. So there's not a whole lot of sensory receptors in the meninges, so that branch is not very big. It doesn't have many nerve fibers in the meningeal branch. So those are the three somatic branches that supply voluntary muscles. They also carry sensory signals from the skin and muscles. In addition, there are two other branches that are part of the autonomic nervous system. And these are called communicating rami. They supply the sympathetic ganglion, which is where the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons in the autonomic nervous system synapse. And so the communicating rami, that's part of that's a different functional division. That's part of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to come back to this, to these communicating rami and the sympathetic ganglion. That will be covered in a whole nother chapter that we're going to eventually go through on the autonomic nervous system. So the three somatic branches is the anterior ramus, the posterior ramus, that supplies the anterior side of the trunk and the posterior side respectively. And then there's a very, very small meningeal branch that supplies the meninges. Okay, any questions? All right. So this is a diagram of the cervical plexus. Cervical plexus is made up of spinal nerves C3 through C5. That cervical plexus gives rise to a long nerve, this one right here, called the phrenic nerve. And that's on both sides of your neck. It extends down on both sides of your trunk to the left and right side of your diaphragm. And so as you see, it's synapsing with the diaphragm. That's what causes your diaphragm to contract. Your diaphragm contracts during inspiration or inhalation. And that's when you take air into your lungs. When that phrenic nerve stops sending out signals, then the diaphragm relaxes and it moves back up again to its normal dome shape. Okay. And this phrenic nerve, though, is actually controlled by the respiratory center, which is located in the medulla oblongata, which is part of the brainstem. Then the next plexus is the brachial plexus. So this, whoops. So you can see there's different parts to this complex interconnected network of nerves. I'm not going to expect that you know all the different parts of the brachial plexus. I'll leave that for graduate school. When I took anatomy, we did need to know all those parts that are color-coded. And I had a lot of trouble with that because this brachial plexus is a three-dimensional structure. But the pictures you see, like this, are only in 2 dimensions. So it's kind of difficult to identify the parts from a picture on a cadaver because the cadaver is 3 dimensions, this is only 2 dimensions. But anyway, the first part of any one of the plexus is made up of the spinal nerves, the roots of the spinal nerves, and then they become connected to form trunks. Then the trunks become connected to form divisions, and then the divisions give rise to cords. The cords eventually give rise to the named nerves that supply the skin and muscles in the arm. Okay? And so there's 3 major nerves that go all the way down to your hand. There's the radial nerve that supplies goes down the radial side of your forearm. There's a median nerve that goes right down the middle of the anterior side of your forearm. And then there's an ulnar nerve that goes down the ulnar side of your forearm. So this is a picture I was looking for earlier that I couldn't find. So this shows the cutaneous distribution of those 3 nerves I just mentioned. So diagram on the left is the anterior side of your hand. So the median nerve supplies the lateral 2/3 of the palm of your hands, along with the palmar surface of your thumb, your first, second, and half of the 4th digit. The ulnar nerve is the one shaded in blue that supplies the medial 1/3 of the palm of your hand, and the ulnar nerve also supplies the medial half of the dorsum of the hand. And then the radial nerve supplies the skin on the lateral part of your hand, and then on the lateral half of the dorsum of your hand, except for the fingertips. So, if any of you are planning on applying to medical school and going to medical school, you're going to need to know this map. Because medical doctors use this information to diagnose injuries, to figure out if a patient has weakness in their hands or fingers and they lose sensation in their fingers. By knowing what parts of their hands have lost sensation, they can tell them what nerve is affected. And then they know where to look to see if there's a problem there where that nerve is located. Okay, I'm not going to ask you that you do that, though. You don't need to worry about this. I'm just showing you this is the kind of thing that you need to learn about in medical school. So when I took anatomy, I memorized that color-coded chart on the Okay, then the next plexus is down here in the lower part of your lumbar region is the lumbar plexus. Again, you can see that it's a complex interconnected network of nerve fibers. And one of the major nerves that gives rise to is the obturator nerve that I mentioned earlier. That supplies the adductor muscles, which are mostly in the upper part of the medial aspect of the thigh. Another even more important one is the femoral nerve. Femoral nerve is the main nerve that supplies your quadriceps in your thigh. And then the next one is the sacral plexus. Sacral plexus is made up of spinal nerves L4 and L5, along with S1 through S5 and the coccygeal nerve. And it gives rise to the sciatic nerve, which eventually branches just above, it forks just above the knee to form the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve, or common peroneal is another name for that nerve. And so that supplies most of the skin and muscles in the lower part of your leg. Very, very common problem that people have sometimes. It's a condition called sciatica, where their sciatic nerve gets inflamed, sometimes just from sitting too much or because of lower back problems. And it's a very, very painful condition where you have pain shooting down the back of your leg. And it's not all that an uncommon problem. And I think it's made worse because we tend to sit for too long instead of spending more time with the feet. Okay. We do have a few more minutes left here. So finally, I want to talk about the structure of just a generalized nerve, like any one of the spinal nerves that I've just been talking about, or any of the named nerves. A nerve is basically just a bundle of axons. That's all it is. It's a bundle of axons. And nerves are actually surrounded by 3 different layers of connective tissue. Okay, much like much like a muscle that we looked at in chapter 10. And so if we start out with the individual axons or nerve fibers in a nerve, each individual axon is surrounded by a connective tissue covering called an endoneurium. And that endoneurium may surround the myelin sheath, which is made up of the neural lemocytes. So each individual nerve fiber is surrounded by an endoneurium. And then within the nerve as a whole, these nerve fibers, all of which are surrounded by an endoneurium, are arranged into bundles called fascicles, just like in a skeletal muscle. And these fascicles or bundles of axons are surrounded by a perineurium. And then the whole nerve is surrounded by an epineurium. Those connective tissue coverings in a nerve help keep the neural impulses from getting crossed over. Keeps getting nerve impulses from spreading from one nerve fiber to another. Because if that happened, then the brain wouldn't know where that signal was coming from. So these connective tissue coverings kind of work as insulators, just like the plastic coating on electrical wires, so you can get a short in the wires. Okay? So most important thing to remember is that a nerve is just a bundle of axons, which are sometimes called nerve fibers. Okay? The cell bodies of those neurons that those axons are part of are usually located in areas like the spinal cord, the gray matter of the spinal cord, or the spinal ganglion, or in the brain. But most most of those ascending and descending tracts in the spinal cord are made up of bundles of these axons. All right, we're out of time, so we'll stop here. When we come back Monday, we'll talk about spinal reflex.